This is the story of how 7, is it, lives, all twisted and braided together over the years, along with the fate of a little plastic baggie full of some sort of weed, and how that event all these years ago, 1972, ended up in the halls of Congress in a congressional hearing, which I did not attend, but I learned that I'm part of the story. As a matter of fact, I am probably the only person who knows the whole story. Now there is one person whose life is entangled, who's not in this video, not in this tale, because his life became entangled with this tale later than the events that I'm recounting. And I apologize to my friend John if in any way the story as I recount it today has some details different from when I recounted it a year or 2 or 3 ago. I do not have an eidetic memory, and so I've been going through the memories over the years recently as the memories have come back to me. And they were not important at the time. It was the most trivial of incidents, and yet it made it to Congress. And the end before the beginning, or the beginning before the end, however, the bottom line is that the important man did, in fact, to the best of his knowledge and understanding, tell the truth under oath. And the scumbag, under oath, sort of kind of came close to telling the truth. And yet the stories are opposite. And this is the explanation of how that came to be. But it goes back many years, and because there are many threads, I have to describe each thread because it does not make sense without knowing each thread. So where to start? I'll start with a girl, young lady named Marilyn. I always get confused whether it's Marilyn or Madeline, but I looked it up the other day. It's Marilyn, I think. She wanted to be a lawyer. At some point in her life, she decided that. But early on, she had another love besides law, and that was the Girl Scouts of America. And she became quite active in Girl Scouts of America and became a youth leader in Girl Scouts of America. And this was in Indiana, which is in some ways the heartland and center of Girl Scouts of America, because there you have the Grand Dame of Girl Scouts of America, lived for many decades, the Witter Kinsey. I won't get into the ups and downs of the Witter Kinsey, but we'll just call her the Witter Kinsey, who was at the University of Indiana and who hosted special events for Girl Scout leaders, young leaders, and older leaders, I guess. But she was involved in this leadership, and at some point or another, she became very close to a young lady who was probably about 4 years younger than her, who she took under her wing and tutored along in the things of Girl Scouts, as she did several of others who became friends through these special Girl Scout programs. And we will be talking about one of them, a young lady named Deborah, at some point here, who is crucial to this and is the one I will now reveal that I've past referred to as the ghost of Thanksgiving past. So, she is missing in action, shall we say. So, Marilyn fulfilled her dream and went to law school, and while she was in a graduate program in 1972 in the autumn, she met another like-minded law student who was a young man and his name was Dan. They fell madly in love. True story. It's you can read all about this. Go online, you can find it. They fell madly in love, and within 6 weeks of meeting one another, they married. Very quick wedding. And having had a quick wedding, instead of inviting all their friends to the wedding the way they would have, after having this quick surprise wedding, they went around on a tour over Thanksgiving holiday, which was the "Hi, old friends, guess what? We're married" tour. And so they piled into their car, which, to my best recollection, was a not quite new Ford Falcon. Matter of fact, it was a kind of an old Ford Falcon, station wagon, painted a hideous shade of pastel by the Ford Motor Company. Was it pink? Was it blue? I don't know. It was just, I just remember it being a hideous pastel shade. I think it was blue. I wouldn't have called it hideous because my Falcon was that color. Maybe it was puke green. I don't know. I just remember it being hideous pastel. How do I remember it? We'll get to it. So, then there's the story of the hats. They're relevant. Very relevant. You see, there's a style of hat that many people call a Smokey the Bear hat, which was used by the cavalry, it was used by Marine drill instructors, and the Boy Scouts of America adopted it, and I liked it in the Boy Scouts of America, but I never could afford one until I was a leader. And I've had 3 of them in my life, and I had one when I was a young leader, and I left it in a restaurant in New York City because I was too stoned to remember to pick it up off the table. That was a different era of my life. Sort of the era I'm talking about, though. But I replaced it. Years later, I replaced the replacement. Got a nice new one, which a young Boy Scout cut a hole in the top of. And I think it burned in my house fire, but whatever. But it's the second hat, which I bought at a surplus store, labeled as a Marine drill instructor hat, and as a matter of fact, it was not. It was a cheap ripoff from the Orient, and it did not fit right. It was a quarter size too small, eighth of a size too small for me anyhow. It was a 7 1/4 instead of a 7 3/8. Didn't fit right. I could jam it on my head. And there it was. So, but in my first hat, I wore that when I hitchhiked across the country, across Canada. Hitchhiked from one end of Canada to the other, and that would have been summer of '71. And I hitchhiked across the country. And as I was going up through past Wawa, Ontario, which is up above Lake Superior in the middle of blankety blank nowhere, I camped beside a road because I was dropped off between one long ride and another long ride. I had about a 24 hours I was stuck there. And I set up my tent, and lo and behold, a group of Girl Scouts hiked in, and they set up their tents. Now, these were college-age Girl Scouts. They were leaders on a special. If you're a leader and you're super special, you could be on this trek across Canada, or across part of Canada. And they were there, and there was one that was there, and she was wearing a hat just like me. I had a Smokey the Bear hat. She had a Smokey the Bear hat. Her name was Deborah Beach, not Deborah Beach, Deborah Beach. But she did not go by Deborah. Some little girl in one of her Girl Scout troops, a brownie troop or something that she had been leading, had called her by her hat. But she had a speech problem, and instead of saying Smokey, she said Mokey. And so this young lady was always known as Mokey Beach because of her Smokey Bear hat. Well, I had a Smokey Bear hat. She had a Smokey Bear hat. We obviously were birds of a feather. One thing and another. I won't give away a lot of her personal secrets, but we will just say that we fell madly in love in an instant. Absolute, total communication, madly in love. And so that continued on until I visited her as she was going to the University of Indiana in the fall, and I visited her in her orientation week in September, or end of August, September, when the semester started. And after a long talk, we realized that much as we were in love, our paths in life were going in different directions, and we agreed to simply be friends. It was sad. But I kept visiting her. I would hitchhike from Maryland out to see her every few months. I got married to someone else, and that had its ups and its downs. That was my first marriage. It had its ups and its downs, and sometimes during the downs I would hitchhike out to see Moki again. And on one of those trips, I found that something had happened. She had lost or given away her Smokey Bear hat, and since mine didn't fit well, I gave mine to her. That's relevant. So, at one point, a year later or so, late in November of 1972, if I got my years right, you can check it in the books. Just check up when Dan and Marilyn got married. It was that fall. It's got to be 72. So my first wife and I hitchhiked to San Francisco, but on the way we stopped in Bloomington, Indiana, University of Indiana, and stayed overnight at the shared house of a bunch of girls who were college students and all had been Girl Scout leaders, one of whom was Moki Beach. And Moki now had a new boyfriend. Now Moki had told me a curious story about her life. She had told me a lot about her life and her loves and so on. But when she was in high school, which she was just coming out of high school when I met her, when she was in high school, she would babysit a neighbor where she lived in Speedway. She said she was from Indianapolis, but when it got down to the detail, it was actually a suburb of Indianapolis called Speedway, for obvious reasons. And she had a neighbor in Speedway, and she thought it was curious that here she was in her mid-teens, and she was babysitting, quote unquote, babysitting a 12-year-old boy, whom she liked very much. It seems this boy had an older brother who had said to Mom, "I am not taking care of Brett anymore." And Brett you couldn't leave him in the house alone. I don't remember all the details of why you couldn't leave him in the house alone, but it was absolute, you could not leave him in the house alone, and his older brother said, "Mom, that's enough. I am not sitting my brother anymore." So she would sit the brother and make sure that nothing happened that involved lots of flashing red and blue lights and all that. Okay. But she liked this kid a lot. She talked to me about him. She liked him a lot. But she thought it was very curious. So here she was when we visited in 72, and there was that boy, except he was now grown. He was now late teens and he was supposed to be in high school, but he was hooking high school and shacking up with her. Now they were in love. Okay. So there we were. It was a little bit of an awkward situation, but they very politely wanted to get rid of us, and we wanted to be on our way, and we needed to get into town to where there was a crash pad, as they called them in those days, so we needed a ride. So we asked for a ride, and if they could see it, and they were about arranging a ride when this Falcon station wagon pulled up. And there was Moki and everybody else's in the house's good friend, Marilyn. And Moki and Marilyn came up and said, "Look, I'm married!" Okay. So Moki went out and talked to Marilyn. Next thing I know, said, "Hey, Marilyn's going to give you a ride to town." So we packed up all our stuff and got in the back seat of Marilyn and Dan's car. So while we're there, Moki says to Brett, little whispers in the ear, and Brett runs back in the house. Now, Brett had been bragging about how he was this huge wholesale dope dealer who was going to be the biggest dope dealer in the country. He was going to bring it up from Mexico, la, 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 la. And I'm going, yeah, right, you're full of it, kid. But, so he comes back and he has a bag of dope, which he hands to Moki, and Moki hands it to Marilyn and says, here's a present. It's a wedding present. Okay. And they whisper some more, and Brett kind of reluctantly goes back in the house, comes out with another bag of dope, which Moki hands to me. Okay. Kind of dope. It was odd stuff. So here I am. So everybody goes back in the house. We go to move off, and the driver reaches over the seat, reaches out his hand and says, "Hi, my name is Dan Quayle. It's just like the bird, but not spelled the same." Okay. This is Maryland. Okay. So we're driving up the road, and we haven't gone more than 100, 200 yards. And he says, "What is that in that bag?" Marilyn holds it up. He sniffs at it. It smells like oregano. Those bags did smell like oregano. My first thought was they're catnip, but you're right. It's a little bit more like oregano. Did not have seeds, did not have sticks. It's like, weird. Is it marijuana or is it not marijuana? So Dan says, you know, we've got plenty of oregano at the house. We don't need any oregano. Notice, he called it oregano. He did not acknowledge that it was anything other than oregano and that it was a joke. He took it as a joke. I repeat, he took it as a joke, that it was a pretend that we're given dope, but it's oregano. Ha, 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 it's a joke. We're pretending to be hippies. That's how he took it. So then he says, "Marilyn, do you want it?" She goes, "Nope." He looks but turns around. Now both of his hands are on the wheel. He has never touched it. We're driving down the road. He turns his head and says, "You want it?" I said, "Yep." So Marilyn hands it to me, and about that quick, another hand comes up, and my first wife takes it and puts it in her backpack. Okay. Where the other bag also was. So that was the end of that. They dropped us off at the crash pad in town. We stayed there a couple days, and then we hitched a ride all the way to San Francisco. On the way, we and the driver of that ride opened a little package, and not while we were driving, I don't think. Yeah, it was while we were driving. Rolled a few, and bang! What was that? It kicked like a mule. Now, I don't know what was in there. I don't know if there was any marijuana in there at all. I suspect it was oregano and catnip that had been laced with DMT, just based on the symptoms. But I don't know. To this day, I don't know. And that was the end of that, except it wasn't. A couple years later, there was a story all over the national papers about a series of bombings going on around Indianapolis, especially around Speedway, Indiana suburb. And eventually somebody was caught, and I won't go into the sordid details, you can look it up. And they had a picture of the guy, and the guy who they caught also had been charged with impersonating a state trooper, and they showed a picture of him in his fake state trooper outfit, and guess what was on his head? A hat that didn't quite fit right. It was too big for him. He has a small head. Hey, that looks like a 7 1/4 cheap imitation Smokey the Bear hat like mine that I gave to my ex-girlfriend who turned into his girlfriend. So, FBI, if that hat is still at Quantico in the evidence room, you might want to swab the band and see if my DNA is on it. If it is, that's my hat. But I don't want it back. But while he was in jail, Dan Quayle ran for Vice President of the United States, and somewhere in the process of that whole thing, Brett started bragging, "Hey, I used to supply dope to that fellow." And he ended up in his orange jumpsuit sitting in the halls of Congress testifying, "Under oath, I used to sell dope to Dan Quayle." And Dan Quayle got up and he put up and said, "Under oath, I don't even know who this guy is." And without mentioning where they had met and how they had met, there's no way he would have remembered them. Remember, Dan and Marilyn were going around from place to place to place to place to place, meeting all of Marilyn's friends and saying, "Hi, we're married." And in most cases, Dan was just staying in the car because they were only taking 5-10 minutes at a time. Why would he remember this one event? So to the best of his knowledge, Dan Quayle told the truth under oath in Congress there. And sort of, kind of, Brett told the truth. But, in fact, that little baggie, which probably was A, not marijuana, B, it never touched Dan Quayle. And that's the end of the story of the ghost of Thanksgiving past, because it was Thanksgiving weekend, with the exception that instead of being a noted lawyer, Deborah Beach has disappeared, just like many people who had inside knowledge about Brett, which makes me wonder. And I wish I knew the answer.